The moment my world cracked open wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, deceptively quiet, like the softest whisper before a hurricane. I was folding laundry in the living room when his phone buzzed on the coffee table. I didn't mean to look, but curiosity pulled me like a magnet. The screen lit up and a name flashed that I had never seen before. My breath hitched. It was late. The house was dark except for the glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains. The silence wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket as I slid closer, heart pounding like a frantic drumbeat. I knew I shouldn't read the message. I told myself to look away, but I didn't. My eyes devoured the words that would shatter every illusion I'd ever held about my marriage. Can't wait to feel your arms around me again. Last night was everything I needed. You're my secret I can't live without. The letters blurred as my vision tunneled. I dropped the laundry basket and pressed my hands against my mouth to stifle a sob I didn't want him to hear. The man I had built my life with, the man who promised me forever, was living a secret life I never imagined. When Michael walked into the room minutes later, his smile faltered the instant he caught my trembling figure and the phone on the floor. His eyes searched mine, panic flashing behind the calm he tried to wear like armor. But in that heartbeat, everything changed. There was no going back from the truth. No more pretending. No more lies. Just the cold, raw exposure of betrayal. The hours after that night stretched endlessly, as if time itself refused to move forward. Michael left the house without a word, his footsteps heavy and uncertain. I sat on the couch, numb, the fragments of my shattered trust scattered around me like broken glass. Sleep was impossible. Every time my eyes closed, I saw his face, the man I loved and the stranger who deceived me, flickering between memory and nightmare. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think. My body was caught in a limbo between shock and seething anger. How had I missed the signs? The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the sudden coldness between us, all explained now, but too late. Friends called, but their voices felt distant. How could I explain this? How could I admit that the foundation of my life had crumbled beneath me? I paced the room, replaying every moment, searching for answers in his actions, in his silences. But all I found was a hollow space where love once lived. That night, I wept for the life I thought I had, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Days later, when Michael finally came home, the tension between us was palpable, a living thing that filled every room, every breath, every glance. I waited until we were alone. My voice was barely steady when I spoke, but it carried the weight of every shattered dream. "Who is she, Michael?" I asked. "How long has this been going on? Why?" He avoided my gaze at first, swallowed hard, then finally exhaled a shaky breath. "It's complicated," he said, voice low and filled with regret. "I never meant to hurt you, but that was the problem. He did hurt me. Deeply, irreparably. He told me about the loneliness he'd felt, the distance growing between us, the mistakes he made trying to fill that void. His words were full of sorrow, but they couldn't erase the betrayal. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run away. But I stayed, rooted by the love I couldn't yet let go of, tangled in the mess of broken promises and desperate hope. The days that followed our confrontation were heavy, laden with a silence thicker than any storm I had ever weathered. Michael and I existed under the same roof, yet felt galaxies apart. We navigated our shared space like strangers with a fragile truce, as if the air itself feared what words might shatter next. Every morning I watched him from the kitchen window, tracing the outline of his silhouette as he left for work. The man who once carried the warmth of home in his smile now seemed distant, as if burdened by invisible chains. The house felt empty, echoing with memories that were no longer ours to share. I wandered from room to room, clutching at moments of tenderness that had dissolved like mist in the harsh sunlight of reality. Inside me a tempest raged, a swirling mix of sorrow, rage, confusion, and an ache so raw it felt like my ribs might break. I asked myself over and over, how do you mourn a love that's still alive? How do you grieve trust that's been shattered? At night, I lay awake, the ceiling above me a blank canvas for the memories that haunted my mind. His whispered apologies, the stolen kisses from years ago, the promises that now felt like lies painted in soft colors. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to rage against the unfairness of it all. But more often, I found myself sinking into quiet despair, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the unspoken. There were moments when I caught him watching me, his eyes full of something I couldn't name. Regret? Shame? Or was it guilt so deep that it paralyzed him? Neither of us dared break the fragile silence, afraid that the wrong word might ignite the fragile wreckage of what remained. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting a golden glow through the curtains, I found myself sitting at the edge of our bed, clutching a letter I had written but never sent. Words I needed to say, confessions of pain and hope intertwined. I don't know if we can rebuild from this, Michael, but I need you to be honest with me, truly honest, for the first time in a long time. Tears blurred the ink as I folded the letter and tucked it into my journal. I wasn't sure if I was ready to give him that chance, but deep down, beneath the layers of hurt, a fragile ember of hope flickered. Because even in the darkest nights, sometimes the smallest light is enough to guide you home. The days turned into weeks, but the ache inside me only grew heavier, like a knot tightening with every thought, every memory. I tried to hold myself together, to keep the pieces of my heart from spilling out in the open, but some nights, the pain was too much. One rainy afternoon, I found myself sitting alone in the cafe where Michael and I first met. The table was worn, scarred by time and countless conversations, but today it felt like a silent witness to my unraveling. I sipped my coffee slowly, watching the raindrops race down the window pane, blurring the world outside just as my thoughts blurred the line between love and betrayal. How did we get here? I wondered. The man who once whispered promises in my ear was now a stranger whose secrets I could barely understand. Then came the call. Michael's voice on the phone was low, hesitant, an echo of the man I once knew but couldn't quite reach anymore. Can we talk? Please. My heart clenched. Was this the moment of reckoning? Or another lie wrapped in sorrow? I agreed, though every fiber of me screamed to run. We met at home, the place that felt more like a battlefield than a refuge. He paced the living room, restless, his eyes dark pools of regret. I can't keep living like this, he confessed, voice breaking. The guilt is suffocating. But there's more, things you don't know. I didn't just lie to you about the affair, I lied to myself. The confession hit me like a tidal wave. What else could there be? Was the betrayal deeper than I feared? He looked at me, desperate for forgiveness but afraid of rejection. I was lost, Scarlett. Lost in my own fears, my own failures. The affair was a symptom, not the cause. I pushed you away before I even knew it. The room seemed to close in around me, the line between victim and culprit blurred. Was I angry at him? At myself? At the invisible poison that had seeped into our marriage? Tears streamed down my face as the walls I'd built around my heart began to crumble. The man I loved was broken, and so was I. But broken didn't mean finished. As the rain drummed against the windows, I realized the hardest battle wasn't just uncovering the lies. It was deciding whether the shattered pieces could ever be made whole again. The house felt unbearably silent the next morning, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. I woke with a dull ache lodged deep in my chest, a heaviness that no amount of sunlight or coffee could lift. Michael was already gone, off to work, leaving, behind a trail of unanswered questions and a room that smelled faintly of his cologne, a cruel reminder of his absence and the secrets it concealed. I sat at the kitchen table, the morning light filtering softly through the curtains, casting long shadows across the surface where I'd once planned a future with him. Now, that table was a battleground of memories and doubts, of whispered promises and broken trust. I picked up my phone, staring blankly at his last message. Just 2 simple words, I'm sorry. They felt like a thin bandage slapped on a gaping wound. How could 3 letters carry the weight of everything that had been shattered? The truth was a jagged line cutting through my thoughts. Michael's confession had opened a door, but behind it lay a labyrinth of pain I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through. My mind drifted back to the night I found the messages. The glow of the phone, the betrayal dripping from every word. But it wasn't just the affair. It was what it revealed about us, about him, about myself. The silences between us that had grown louder than any argument. The loneliness that had nestled inside our marriage like an unwelcome guest. That day, I spent hours pacing, wrestling with the storm inside me. I wanted to scream, to shake him until he understood the destruction he had wrought. But I also wanted to understand the why beneath the what. Why had he looked elsewhere? Why had he hidden the cracks instead of fixing them? Why had I failed to see the warning signs? When Michael returned that evening, the tension in the room was palpable. We sat across from each other, a fragile gulf stretching between us. He looked at me, eyes heavy with remorse. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. "I just want you to know I'm trying. Not for me, for us." I wanted to believe him. Desperately. But my heart was a war zone where hope and despair battled fiercely. "I don't know if we can fix this," I whispered. "But I want to try. For the sake of what we had, or maybe what we still could have." He reached out, hesitating, then took my hand in his. The contact was electric, both comforting and terrifying. That night, as I lay awake, I realized that love was no longer simple or pure. It was complicated, marred by pain, yet still flickering with possibility. But the road ahead was uncertain and steep. Trust, once broken, does not mend easily. And I wasn't sure if either of us was strong enough to walk it alone. The mornings had become the hardest. Each dawn brought with it a fresh wave of uncertainty that clung to me like the chill in the air. The bed where Michael once lay beside me felt cavernous and cold, the sheets untouched by his presence for hours before he left for work. I would watch the clock, waiting for the faint sound of his keys, the footsteps crossing the porch. Little rituals that once gave me comfort, now only underscored the fragile silence that swallowed us whole. I found myself lost in the labyrinth of memories, tracing back to the moments that felt like cracks in the foundation of our marriage. The stolen glances he'd cast at his phone, the vague explanations for late nights, the subtle withdrawal from conversations that once flowed easily between us. Each memory gnawed at my soul, a relentless reminder of how deeply he had woven lies into the fabric of our shared life. One afternoon, I sat alone in the corner of our once joyful living room, the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the lace curtains. The house smelled faintly of his cologne, a bittersweet scent that reminded me of better days. My fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of my coffee cup as I wondered, how do you rebuild a heart after it's been shattered by the one you trusted most? Michael entered quietly, his steps hesitant as he approached me. His eyes, dark and tired, searched my face for a sign. Hope, forgiveness, or perhaps something else I couldn't yet name. "I've been thinking," he began, voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we need help. Someone outside us to guide this." His admission was both humbling and terrifying. Therapy, counseling, words that felt like a lifeline tossed into the turbulent sea we were drowning in. I nodded slowly, the knot in my throat tightening. "I want to try," I confessed. "But it's going to take more than words. It's going to take honesty, complete honesty. No more secrets." He reached for my hand, his touch tentative but real. "I'm ready. For the first time, I want to face everything. No more running." The days that followed were a delicate dance between hope and fear. We made the calls, scheduled appointments, and took tentative steps toward confronting the wreckage head-on. Yet beneath the surface, old wounds throbbed fiercely. The ghost of betrayal lingered in every glance, every touch. One night, lying awake as the house slipped into silence, I felt the weight of all the unspoken words pressing down on me. The fear that maybe, despite everything, the damage was too deep. The terror that the man beside me, the man I loved, might never fully return from the shadows where his secrets hid. But somewhere inside me, a fragile flame still flickered. The belief that even fractured hearts might one day beat together again, stronger for the scars they bore. The rain had been falling steadily all morning, drumming against the windows in a relentless, mournful rhythm. It was as if the sky itself was weeping with me, mourning the love that felt so fragile, so painfully fragile, in this cold house. Outside, the world was gray and washed out. Inside, my heart echoed the same emptiness. I sat at the kitchen table, clutching a mug of lukewarm tea, my fingers trembling with exhaustion and dread. The promise of therapy seemed distant, almost like a fragile dream slipping through my fingers the more I tried to grasp it. Michael was silent these days, his words cautious and sparse, like stepping on thin ice that threatened to crack with the slightest misstep. This morning, I found myself staring at the cracked photo frame on the mantelpiece, the one from our wedding day. We looked so young, so full of hope and unspoken dreams. How had time twisted us into these strangers who barely spoke without walls rising between them? The truth was settling in with a weight I could no longer ignore, some things hid beneath the surface, festering quietly until they shattered everything. I remembered the day I confronted Michael, the rawness in his eyes when he confessed the loneliness that had led him astray. But I was starting to realize now that loneliness was only part of the story. There were hidden truths, secrets darker and more complex than infidelity, shadows he refused to share even in his moments of broken honesty. The tension between us grew like a silent storm, an unspoken question hanging in the air. What else isn't he telling me? That evening, after a long day of rehearsing forced smiles and fragile hope, I finally reached my limit. Michael came home late, the familiar exhaustion in his eyes deepened by something else, a burden I couldn't yet name. The house was quiet, but the air was thick with unsaid words. "I can't do this anymore," I said, voice breaking as tears threatened to spill. "I need the truth, Michael, not half-truths or excuses. Everything." He looked at me, his jaw clenched, and for a moment I saw the man who was fighting his own demons, fighting for us. Then, with a slow, painful breath, he began to unravel the stories he'd buried deep inside. Stories of mistakes I hadn't imagined, fears that had driven him to darkness, moments of weakness that had nothing to do with me, or so he claimed. He spoke of battles with his own self, worth, wounds from the past he'd hidden beneath layers of charm and lies. I listened, heart pounding, tears falling freely now. The man I loved was not just a stranger, but a man broken in ways I had never known. Yet, beneath the pain, a flicker of something else, hope? Or was it despair dressed as hope? Lingered. We sat together, two fractured souls laid bare in the dim light, wrestling with the messy, painful truth that love isn't enough when the shadows run deep. The fragile thread of hope that tethered me to Michael felt thinner than ever, stretched taut across an abyss of mistrust and unspoken fears. The days grew heavier, and the silence between us became a chasm too wide to bridge with mere words. I found myself drifting through the house like a ghost, each room a shrine to memories that once sparked joy but now seethed with bitterness. Our photographs, smiling faces frozen in time, mocked the present, reminding me of the love that was unraveling beneath my very feet. Michael and I tried to speak, to piece together what remained of us, but the effort was exhausting. His eyes often clouded with shame, mine brimming with unshed tears. We circled each other warily, like dancers learning a broken rhythm, afraid to misstep and shatter what little trust was left. One evening, I caught him staring at his phone again. The familiar pang of suspicion ignited, sharp and cold. When I asked about it, his evasive answers felt like fresh wounds. It wasn't just the affair anymore. It was the fear that new secrets lurked beneath the surface. The thought clawed at me relentlessly. Was I fighting a losing battle against shadows I couldn't even see? The tension seeped into every interaction. The simplest conversations turned into battlegrounds. I found myself questioning every word, every glance, every silence. And yet, despite the storm raging inside, a part of me clung stubbornly to the man I had loved, the man I wanted to believe still existed beneath the lies and pain. One night, as rain hammered against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance, the walls between us finally cracked wide open. Michael confessed a truth he had buried deeper than the affair itself, a secret that explained the fissures in his heart and the darkness that had consumed him. He spoke of a past mistake, a betrayal not of love but of trust with someone from years ago, a wound never fully healed, haunting him in the quiet moments. His admission hit me like a freight train. It was the missing piece in the puzzle, the hidden fracture that had weakened everything. I didn't know if I could forgive that either. As we sat in the dim glow of the living room, two broken souls laid bare, I realized that love alone was no shield against the ghosts we carried. Healing would demand more than promises. It would require courage to face the past and the unvarnished truth of who we really were. The days that followed Michael's confession were unlike any we had experienced. The secret he revealed, the dark scar etched into his past, hung between us like a heavy fog, coloring every glance, every word with a shade of uncertainty that neither of us could easily shake off. I tried to understand. I wanted to. After all, his truth was raw, painful, and laid bare without hesitation. But understanding did not equate to forgiveness, and forgiveness was a mountain I wasn't sure I was ready or strong enough to climb. Morning light filtered through the bedroom curtains, casting soft patterns on the sheets that felt colder than before. I lay awake, my mind a chaotic swirl of questions, fears, and reluctant hope. Could love survive such raw honesty? Or would the weight of his past crush what was left of us beneath it? Michael was different now, quieter, more distant, yet more vulnerable than ever. The walls he had built around himself were beginning to crumble, exposing the fragile man inside who wanted to heal but didn't know how. We began therapy, a daunting step into the unknown. The first sessions were torturous. Words stumbled out awkwardly, silences stretched painfully, and emotions overflowed like a dam breaking free. Our counselor watched patiently as we navigated the maze of grief, guilt, and longing. One afternoon, I found myself sitting alone in the park near our home, the crisp air brushing against my cheeks as I clutched a letter I had written but never sent. In it, I poured out my fears, my heartbreak, and my tentative hope for a future that seemed both impossibly distant and desperately necessary. The letter was a confession, a mirror held up to my soul. It read, "Michael, I don't know what the future holds. The pain is real, and so is the love I still carry. I want to believe in us, but the path ahead is shadowed and uncertain. All I ask is honesty, patience, and the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful." Tears blurred the ink as I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my journal. I wasn't sure if I would ever give it to him. Sometimes, the act of writing felt like the only way to make sense of the chaos inside. At home, Michael was wrestling with his own demons. Late at night, I would hear him pacing the floor, his breaths ragged and raw. The burden of guilt was a constant companion, whispering doubts and regrets that kept him awake. One evening, after a particularly difficult session, he finally broke down. The man who had once seemed so strong, so unshakable, crumpled before me in a torrent of tears and apologies. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm trying. I don't want to lose you, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to fix this." I reached out, my hand trembling as it found his. In that moment, two fractured souls touched, not whole, not healed, but desperately trying. The road ahead was long and uncertain. There would be setbacks, pain, and moments when hope felt like a distant memory. But beneath it all, a fragile ember glowed. The possibility of redemption, the chance to rebuild what had been broken. Because sometimes, love isn't about perfection. It's about the courage to keep trying, even when everything feels impossible. The days began to fold into one another in a blur of tentative steps and uneasy silences. The fragile thread of hope that tethered Michael and me was stretched thin, but it was there, a delicate lifeline amid the storm of pain and mistrust. Therapy sessions had become a crucible for our emotions. We sat side by side, baring our souls to a stranger who gently pulled at the tangled knots of our past. Every session peeled back, layers of hurt and misunderstanding, exposing wounds that neither of us had dared to fully confront before. Michael was often quiet in those moments, his eyes heavy with the weight of regret. I could see the fight inside him, a battle between the man who had made grievous mistakes and the man desperate to be better. It was a struggle that left him exhausted, and at times I feared it would break him. I too was unraveling. Some days the pain was so raw it consumed me. The echo of his betrayal haunted every corner of my mind. How do you forgive someone who has shattered your world? How do you trust again when every instinct screams caution? One afternoon, as the rain drummed softly against the window panes, I found myself alone in the quiet house. The stillness pressed down like a weight, and I sank onto the couch, clutching a worn photograph of us from happier days. The smiles frozen in time felt achingly distant, as if they belonged to strangers. I thought about the nights when Michael would call me softly, his voice trembling with apologies and promises I wasn't sure I could believe anymore. The moments when we sat together, hands barely touching, both afraid to bridge the chasm growing between us. That evening, Michael came home later than usual. I waited in the living room, heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. When he stepped inside, rain-drenched and weary, his eyes met mine, a flicker of vulnerability shining through the exhaustion. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said quietly. "Work ran over, but that's not the only reason." He sank into the armchair, fingers nervously twisting the hem of his shirt. "I've been thinking about us, about everything we've been through." I nodded slowly, urging him to go on. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want to try harder. I want to be the man you believed in, the man I want to be, for you, for us." His words stirred something deep inside me, a fragile hope wrapped in layers of fear. "It's not just about trying," I whispered. "It's about healing, and healing takes time." We sat in silence then, two souls tangled in love and pain, suspended between forgiveness and fear. But the road ahead was anything but smooth. Over the next weeks, small fractures began to appear. Doubts whispered in my mind. Old wounds throbbed unexpectedly. Michael's occasional withdrawals, the lingering look at his phone, the distracted responses, stirred shadows I wasn't ready to face. One night, I overheard his phone buzz repeatedly with messages he quickly silenced. The familiar pang of suspicion flared, sharper than before. I wanted to confront him, but the fear of shattering what little peace we'd built held me back. That night, I lay awake, wrestling with the haunting question: can love survive when the ghosts of betrayal refuse to rest? The answer was elusive, wrapped in the tangled mess of our fractured hearts. The fragile piece that Michael and I had begun to weave together started to fray under the weight of silent suspicions and unspoken fears. Each day became a tightrope walk, a careful balance between wanting to trust and being haunted by the shadows of the past. I remember the exact moment the unease crept back into our home. It was late, too late for visitors, too late for distractions, and Michael had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from yet another grueling day. The soft glow of his phone on the coffee table caught my eye, illuminating a name I didn't recognize. My heart clenched. It was a name I had promised myself I would never see again, but there it was, staring back at me like an old wound refusing to heal. I told myself to look away, to let it go. But the flickering screen whispered secrets I wasn't prepared to ignore. I picked up the phone, hands trembling, and hesitated before unlocking it. What I found inside shattered the fragile trust we'd painstakingly built. Messages full of warmth and longing. Plans for meetings I hadn't been invited to. Whispered promises made in the dark. I felt my world tilt once again. Michael stirred, eyes fluttering open. I held the phone in my hand, the weight of the truth pressing down like a stone. He saw the look in my eyes, devastation mingled with fury and heartbreak. "I can explain," he murmured, voice thick with regret. But the words felt hollow. "Why?" I whispered. "Why again?" He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I thought I was done with it," he said quietly. "But it's complicated." Complicated. The word echoed in the room, a bitter reminder of all the lies layered beneath our fragile facade. That night, the silence between us was suffocating. The distance grew deeper, the walls closing in like a prison of our own making. I realized that healing wasn't linear. It was a jagged path filled with setbacks and betrayals, some hidden, some laid bare. The man I loved was fighting his own demons, but those demons still threatened to tear us apart. As I lay awake, tears slipping silently down my cheeks, I asked myself if love was enough to survive the storms we faced, or if some wounds ran too deep to ever fully heal. The fragile threads of our fragile hope had been tested time and again. But that night, something inside me finally snapped. The house was thick with tension. Michael and I had barely spoken all evening. The air felt charged with unspoken words and hidden pain. I could see it in his eyes, the exhaustion, the guilt, the desperate wish to fix what seemed irreparable. Yet in my own heart a storm was gathering, furious and unforgiving. I sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen, the silence pressing against my skin like a physical weight. My hands trembled as I poured a glass of water, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The memories of the past months swirled through my mind, the late-night messages I had discovered, the confessions he had whispered, the empty apologies, and the fragile promises that felt more like desperate grasping at straws. The betrayal was a deep wound, but what hurt even more was the endless cycle: hope, disappointment, forgiveness, and then heartbreak again. Michael entered quietly, rubbing his hands nervously. He stopped when he saw me, his eyes searching for any sign of warmth or acceptance. "We can't keep going like this," I said, my voice breaking but resolute. "I don't know how to do this anymore." He swallowed hard, his face pale. "I know. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you this way." I looked at him, really looked, and saw the man he was beneath all the mistakes. A man broken by his own fears and weaknesses, just like me. Tears spilled over as I whispered, "I love you. But love isn't enough. Not anymore." The silence stretched between us, heavy and final. That night I realized that sometimes love means knowing when to hold on, and when to let go. The morning light seeped weakly through the curtains, casting pale shadows on the cold wooden floor. I lay awake long before the sun fully rose, my mind a tempest of questions and regrets. The night's confrontation lingered in the air like a thick fog, enveloping everything in uncertainty. Michael had left the room quietly, his footsteps muffled by the soft carpet, but the weight of his absence was as palpable as if he had slammed the door behind him. I wanted to reach out, to call him back, to plead for the fragile thread that still connected us. But my voice was caught somewhere deep inside, strangled by fear and exhaustion. For hours I wrestled with my thoughts. Could a love so battered be mended? Was there room for forgiveness amid the shards of broken trust? Or was I fooling myself, chasing a ghost of what once was. The memories flooded back, the laughter we shared, the dreams whispered in the quiet moments, the promises etched in our hearts. But those memories were now fractured, tinged with the bitter aftertaste of betrayal. I rose slowly, moving through the silent house like a shadow. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and shared mornings, now felt hollow. I brewed coffee, the bitter aroma filling the air but failing to soothe the ache inside me. Michael appeared then, hesitant, eyes dark with sleepless nights and unspoken apologies. We stood facing each other, two broken souls caught in a delicate dance of love and pain. "I don't want this to end like this," he said, voice low and raw. "I don't know if it has to," I replied, tears threatening to spill. The room seemed to hold its breath as we searched each other's faces for signs of hope or surrender. But the truth was clear, we were at a crossroads. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with pain, but it was ours to choose. Would we find a way to heal, to rebuild the fragile bridge between us? Or would the fractures grow too wide, leaving us to drift apart like strangers in the night? As the day unfolded, we took small steps, tentative conversations, cautious touches, moments of silence filled with meaning. Each moment was a test of faith, a fragile promise that love could survive even the deepest wounds. But beneath the surface, shadows remained, whispers of doubt and fear that threatened to pull us under. And so we moved forward, not knowing what awaited us but choosing to face it together. The early morning air carried a faint chill as sunlight seeped cautiously through the blinds, casting soft stripes across the floorboards. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, trying to steady the whirlwind inside me. The quiet was almost deceptive, masking the turmoil that had become the backdrop of our days and nights. Michael was in the living room, his voice low and thoughtful as he spoke to the therapist during our latest session. I listened from the hallway, catching fragments of confessions and admissions that tugged at my heart, raw and unguarded. Each word was like a small crack in the walls we had both built, walls meant to shield but which only imprisoned us further. As we left the session, the sky was overcast, the clouds heavy and gray, mirroring the uncertainty that clung to us. Michael's hand brushed mine briefly, a tentative gesture but one I grasped fiercely. "Can we really do this?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, eyes filled with a mixture of hope and exhaustion. "We have to try." For us, the days that followed were a series of small battles, conversations that required courage, moments when silence screamed louder than words, and countless times when doubt threatened to unravel the fragile fabric we were sewing together. I found myself watching him more closely, the way his smile faltered when he thought I wasn't looking, the fatigue that weighed down his shoulders, the way he sought reassurance in the smallest things. And yet beneath the pain, I caught glimpses of the man I once loved, the man who wanted to heal, to fight for us. But trust, once broken, is a delicate thing. It flickers like a candle in the wind, easily extinguished by one careless breath. I struggled to silence the voices of suspicion that haunted my thoughts, the fear that the ghosts of the past would return to claim their place. One evening, after a long day filled with tentative progress, Michael sat beside me on the couch. His hand found mine again, warmer this time, more certain. "I'm scared," he confessed. "Scared I'll lose you forever." I squeezed his hand, tears spilling over despite myself. "I'm scared too," I admitted. "But maybe that fear means we still have something worth fighting for." As the night deepened, we talked, really talked, about our fears, our hopes, and the scars that still ached beneath the surface. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in months, I felt a fragile spark of something precious, hope. The dawn broke with a hesitant light, barely touching the edges of the day, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. I awoke with a restless mind, 1,000 questions swirling like autumn leaves caught in a relentless wind. The silence of the house pressed heavily against me, the silence between Michael and me, laden with fragile hope and lingering fear. We had made promises, spoken words full of intention and tentative faith, but promises are easy to make, hard to keep. The first weeks of rebuilding trust were a mosaic of small moments, a sincere good morning, a hand held during a quiet walk, a shared glance that spoke volumes. Yet beneath these gestures lay a battlefield of doubt and old wounds, invisible to anyone but us. One evening, Michael came home earlier than usual. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights and endless remorse. He hesitated at the doorway, as if uncertain whether he belonged there. I met him halfway in the living room, the air thick with unsaid fears. "We need to be honest," I said, voice steady despite the storm inside me. "No more half-truths, no more hiding." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I want that too. But it's not easy. Sometimes the past still grabs hold of me." We sat together, hands intertwined, and he began to speak, not just of the affair, but of the deeper struggles that had pulled him into darkness. The shame he carried, the loneliness he masked behind smiles, the battles with his own self-worth. His confession was a torrent, raw and unfiltered, leaving me breathless and aching. Yet in his vulnerability I found a thread of connection, fragile but real. But healing isn't a straight path. That very week, an unexpected phone call shook the fragile peace we'd built. A voice from his past, the woman from the affair, reached out, reopening wounds we thought had begun to heal. The tension between us snapped tight. Trust wavered, fear flared, and I was left questioning if the man I loved could truly leave the past behind. We faced a choice: retreat into old wounds or stand together against the shadows that threatened to consume us. As I looked into Michael's eyes that night, I realized the fight for love was far from over. But perhaps with every broken piece we gathered, we could build something stronger, something real. The night air was thick with tension, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes every breath feel heavy. After the call from her, Michael sat silently in the living room, eyes fixed on the muted television, but his mind was far away, trapped in a storm of guilt and fear. I watched him from the doorway, heart pounding with a mixture of anger, hurt, and desperate hope. This was the moment I had dreaded, the moment when the past would claw its way back into our fragile present. "Who was that?" I finally asked, my voice trembling but steady. Michael didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath, then met my eyes with a raw vulnerability I hadn't seen in months. "It's her," he said simply. "The woman from the affair." A cold wave of betrayal crashed over me, sharper than I expected. "Why did she call?" "Something about needing closure," he whispered. "She said she wanted to be sure I was done with her." I wanted to scream, to tell him it was over, that it should never have begun. But the silence between us stretched taut with unspoken fears. That night we talked for hours, the pain, the doubts, the lingering ghosts that refused to stay buried. Michael confessed the depth of his regret, the battle within himself to stay away, to be faithful, to rebuild what he had broken. I listened, torn between wanting to believe and fearing that the wounds were too deep to heal. In the days that followed, the call became a shadow over our lives. Michael's phone buzzed again, and again, each message a test of my fragile trust. I found myself watching him, searching for signs that he was truly committed to us, that the past wouldn't pull him back into darkness. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Michael sat beside me, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "I'm sorry," he said, voice breaking. "I never wanted this to hurt you again. I want to be better, for you." Tears slipped down my cheeks as I reached for his hand, holding on to the man I loved. Imperfect, broken, but fighting. The road ahead was uncertain, but in that moment I chose to believe in us. To believe that love, no matter how battered, could still find a way to heal. Morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a gentle glow over the quiet house. I sat at the breakfast table, the steam rising from my coffee swirling in the stillness. Across from me, Michael moved slowly, his eyes heavy but determined. There was a fragile tenderness between us now, a delicate thread spun from shared pain, tentative hope, and an unspoken promise to try again. The past weeks had been some of the hardest of my life, each day a battle against fear, doubt, and the shadows of betrayal. Yet, amidst the turmoil, there were moments, brief, shining moments, when I glimpsed the man I once loved, the man fighting to come back from the edge. We had agreed to rebuild slowly, cautiously. Therapy sessions continued, each one peeling back layers of hurt and misunderstanding. Sometimes we cried. Sometimes we argued. But slowly, we began to speak the language of healing, honesty, vulnerability, and forgiveness. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional session, Michael reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was firm but gentle, a silent declaration of his commitment. "I know it won't be easy," he said softly, "but I want to spend every day proving to you that I'm here, for real this time." Tears pricked my eyes. I want that too, I whispered. But I'm scared. Scared of losing myself again? He nodded, understanding the depth of my fear. We'll take it one day at a time, together. As days turned into weeks, we learned to celebrate the small victories, a shared laugh, a touch without hesitation, a night spent without the weight of silence pressing down. Yet beneath the surface, the scars remained, reminders of the fragility of trust and the work still to be done. One evening, as we sat wrapped in a quiet embrace, I realized that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about choosing to face it, together. With each fragile step forward, we were weaving a new story, one marked not by perfection, but by courage, resilience, and a love tested by fire, yet still burning bright. The house felt different now, softer, more forgiving. It wasn't that the past had disappeared, far from it. The memories of betrayal and heartbreak still lingered like shadows on the edges of our days. But amid those shadows there was light, a gentle, steady light born from the slow, patient work of healing. I woke early one morning, sunlight spilling through the window in golden streams. Michael was already up, quietly preparing coffee in the kitchen. I watched him from the doorway, the simple rhythm of his movements filling me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. We had learned to cherish these small, quiet moments, the unspoken promises held in a glance, the comfort of a hand finding yours in the stillness of dawn. These moments were the stitches slowly sewing together the fabric of our broken trust. Our therapy sessions had shifted too. Where once there had been raw, painful confessions, now there were discussions of hope, dreams, and rebuilding. We talked about the future, cautiously, but with growing confidence. One afternoon we sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cool breeze. Michael reached over, his fingers entwining with mine. "I'm grateful," he said softly, "for your strength. For your willingness to keep trying, even when it was hard." Tears welled in my eyes. "We're both learning," I replied. "Love isn't perfect, but it's worth fighting for." We sat in silence, the world around us waking slowly with the promise of spring. But healing, I realized, was not a destination. It was a journey, winding, uneven, and sometimes painful. And in that journey we had found something precious. A new foundation, built not on illusion, but on truth, forgiveness, and a love that had been tested by fire and still endured. As I looked at Michael, I saw not the man who had broken my heart, but the man who was committed to mending it, day by day, moment by moment. And that made all the difference. The soft light of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. I woke slowly, the calmness settling deep inside me like a gentle tide washing away the remnants of pain. For the first time in a long while, the weight on my heart felt lighter, replaced by a quiet strength born from the long winding path we had traveled together. Michael was still asleep beside me, his breathing steady and peaceful. I reached out, tracing the lines of his face, marked not just by years, but by the battles we had fought and the healing we had nurtured. This was the man I had vowed to love, broken though he was, and the man who was choosing to rebuild, piece by piece, day by day. Our journey had been far from easy. The betrayals, the secrets, the nights filled with tears and silence, they had carved deep scars in our hearts. Yet, amid the darkness, we found light. Not the blinding, perfect kind, but the steady, enduring glow of hope and forgiveness. We had learned to listen in new ways, to speak truths even when they hurt, and to hold each other with a tenderness born from understanding. The fragile threads of trust had begun to weave a stronger fabric, one that could withstand storms, as long as we both held on. That morning, as the world outside began to stir, I felt something shift within me. The fear that once held me captive was giving way to courage. The wounds that had seemed insurmountable were beginning to heal. And the love, though changed, was still there, real, resilient, and ready for the future. Michael stirred awake, his eyes meeting mine with a softness that took my breath away. "Good morning," he whispered. "Good morning," I replied, smiling through tears. "Here's to new beginnings." We rose together, stepping into the day hand in hand, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Not as perfect souls, but as two imperfect hearts choosing each other again. Because sometimes the greatest love stories are those written not in flawless chapters, but in the courage to rebuild, forgive, and grow, together. Love is never simple. It is a journey, winding, messy, and sometimes painful beyond words. It is tested by fire and shadowed by doubt. It demands courage, patience, and above all, a willingness to forgive not only others but ourselves. As I look back on the path Michael and I walked, the brokenness, the tears, the quiet moments of hope, I realize that what we rebuilt was not a perfect love. It was something far more profound, a love forged in truth, humility, and resilience. Forgiveness was not a destination but a daily choice. A choice to see beyond mistakes, to hold on to the fragile thread of trust and to believe in the possibility of healing. Our story is not unique, but it is ours. It is a testament to the strength of the human heart and the power of second chances. To anyone who has felt the sting of betrayal, who has wondered if love can survive the deepest wounds, I offer this truth. Healing is possible. Love can endure. And sometimes the greatest strength lies in choosing to stay, to fight, and to love again. Because in the end, love is not about perfection. It is about grace. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you loved it and you would love for more, kindly comment below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon for more amazing content. Drop a comment with your favorite moment, and I'll see you in the next one.